They laughed when she built a log walkway to her woodshed. Elias Broder, who had survived 22 winters framing timber camps along the Chippewa and buried a wife and two sons to the cold, told her plainly, "You keep stealing logs from your stove, and your boy will freeze before Candlemas." She had $21, one son, and no safe way to cross 50 feet of open ice to reach the fuel that kept them alive. On January 17, 1887, freezing rain fell for 8 hours and sealed the settlement under a sheet of glass. But 4 months earlier, Ragna Tveit Halverson had never framed a roofed structure or set a line of posts in her life. She had arrived in Buffalo County in late August of 1886 with a husband, a son, and a trunk that held more hope than tools. By September, the husband was dead. The wagon had tipped crossing a creek bed swollen from 3 days of rain. Jens Halvorsen caught the edge of the box across his chest and spent 4 days coughing before the fever took him. Ragna buried him on the claim they had not yet proved up, in ground so newly broken the shovel still turned strange. The minister came from 11 miles away and spoke words she barely heard. When he left, he took the better horse as payment. She had $21 in a tin behind the stove. She had a boy of 8 who had watched his father die. She had a half-built cabin with gaps in the north wall wide enough to pass a hand through, a woodshed 50 feet across open ground, and less than 2 cords of split birch stacked inside it. She owed $14 on seed and iron goods to a storekeeper who had already mentioned twice that widows sometimes found it easier to sell improvements and move closer to family. She had no family closer than an ocean. The claim agent in town had been clear. Abandon the property before proving up and she forfeited everything. Stay and fail to improve it, same result. The only path forward ran straight through a Wisconsin winter with a structure half finished, fuel half gathered, and no grown person to share the labor. Ragna stood in the yard the morning after the minister left. The woodshed door hung slightly open. Inside, she could see the pale ends of split birch stacked against the back wall. 2 cords. Maybe less. The book said a household needed 6 cords to survive a hard winter. Some said 8. The distance between her and that wood was 50 feet. 50 feet she would have to cross, and cross again, and cross again, dozens of times a day when the cold came. 50 feet, through whatever the sky decided to throw down. 50 feet, that in deep snow became a trench. 50 feet, that in thaw and freeze became a skating rink. 50 feet, that in driving sleet became a gauntlet of wind and ice, and the kind of cold that stopped your lungs mid-breath. She had seen what happened to people who fell in winter. She had seen it twice on the crossing from Norway, when deckhands slipped on ice planking and never got up the same way again. She had seen it once in the lumber camp where Jens worked his first American winter, when a man named Erickson went down on a frozen path between bunkhouse and cook shack and broke his hip so badly they heard the sound from inside. Erickson died 11 days later. Not from the break. From the cold he caught lying on the ice while men scrambled to reach him. The distance was the danger, not the cold itself. The distance you had to cross through it. Elias Broder came to inspect the property 3 days after the burial. He was 58 years old, thick through the shoulders, with hands that looked like they had been carved from the same wood he spent his life shaping. He had survived 22 winters in the timber camps along the Chippewa corridor, first as a cutter, then as a framer, now as a foreman who rebuilt whatever the snow collapsed. Men said Elias could look at a structure and see where it would fail before the first frost touched it. Men also said Elias had buried a wife and 2 sons to winters bad enough to split green wood. He walked the claim slowly. He pressed his palm against the north wall of the cabin and held it there. He counted the gaps with his eyes. He crossed to the woodshed, looked inside, and counted again. When he came back, Ragna was waiting with Nels beside her, the boy's hand in hers. Elias stopped 6 feet away. He did not remove his hat. "Half your north seam leaks," he said. "I can see light through 3 places." Ragna said nothing. "Your roof edge drips on the doorstep. Come winter, that drip freezes. You step out in the dark, you go down. She waited. You have maybe 1.5 cords in that shed. Maybe. I have seen men burn a cord a week in a bad stretch. You need 6 minimum, 6 to live, 8 to be safe. I know what I need, Ragna said. Elias looked at the boy. Nels stared back, jaw tight. In that way children hold themselves when they are trying not to show fear. The shed sits too far to fetch from in a storm, Elias said. 50 feet across open ground. No windbreak, no cover, nothing to hold on to if you go down. You try to make that run in a blizzard with an armload of wood, you are not coming back. Then I will not make it in a blizzard. The weather does not ask permission. Elias turned his head and spat into the dirt. You keep stealing logs from your stove, and your boy will freeze before Candlemas. The words hit like a slap. Ragna felt Nels's hand tighten in hers. I am not here to help you, Elias said. I am here because Jens owed 2 days' work to the Lindqvist crew, and the crew sent me to see if there is anything worth collecting. There is not. What I see is a widow with 1 boy, a cabin that leaks, a shed too far to reach, and not enough wood to matter. He looked at the distance between the cabin and the shed one more time. If you were smart, you would sell the improvements to Vic before the snow comes. Take whatever he offers. Use it to get the boy somewhere safe. This is somewhere safe, Ragna said. Elias shook his head slowly, the way a man shakes his head at a child who has just explained why jumping from a high place will be fine. It is not, he said, and by January, you will know it. He left without looking back. Ragna did not sleep that night. She lay in the narrow bed she had shared with Jens for 3 months, listening to Nels breathe in the corner, listening to the wind test the north wall, listening to the small sounds of a house that was not yet ready to be a house. The numbers ran through her mind in a loop she could not stop. $21, 14 owed to Vic. That left 7. A cord of cut wood cost $4 delivered, if you could find anyone willing to deliver this far from the mill road. 2 cords would cost $8. She did not have $8. She could cut wood herself. The timber was there. The claim bordered a stand of birch and some oak that had not been logged yet. But cutting was one thing, hauling was another, splitting was another, stacking was another. Each step took time, and time was running out. The first hard freeze could come in 6 weeks or 6 days. No one knew. And even if she had the wood, even if she cut and hauled and split and stacked 6 cords, 8 cords, 10 cords, it would not matter if she could not reach it. 50 feet. The number returned like a drumbeat. 50 feet between the stove and the fuel. 50 feet that would become a battlefield the first time freezing rain glazed the yard. 50 feet that a woman alone, carrying wood with a child to protect, might not survive crossing. She thought about Erickson again, the sound of his hip breaking, the 11 days it took him to die. She thought about her father. Her father had been a timber hand in the old country, working the forests around Hardanger before the land played out and the ships started calling. He had not been a warm man. He had not been the kind of father who held his children or spoke soft words when they were frightened, but he had been a teacher in his way. He had shown her things. She remembered one afternoon when she was 9 years old. Snow on the ground, not deep, but heavy with moisture. Her father had taken her to the woodshed behind the house, not the house they lived in, but the house belonging to the farmer he worked for, a proper farm with proper outbuildings. The woodshed there had a covered walkway connecting it to the kitchen, a narrow passage maybe 20 feet long with a roof of bark and walls of stacked poles. Her father had crouched beside the wall and pressed his fingers into a seam packed with moss. "Feel that," he said. She had reached out and touched it. Cold, damp, springy. "Moss holds air," her father said. "Air holds warmth. Warmth holds life." He rapped his knuckles against the wall. The sound was dull, solid. The deadliest distance in winter is the distance with no roof over it, he said. A man can survive cold. A man cannot survive a fall on ice with no one to help him up. She had not understood then. She had been 9 years old, standing in a passage she took for granted, watching her father tap walls and speak in riddles. She understood now. The idea came to her before dawn, in that gray space between sleep and waking where the mind runs free of its usual fences. She was not thinking about survival. She was thinking about the passage in her memory, that narrow covered walkway between the farmer's kitchen and his woodshed. She was thinking about how her father had walked it every day, in every weather, without fear, a roof over the distance. She sat up in the dark. Nels did not stir. The thought expanded. If the problem was not the wood, but the distance to the wood, if the problem was the open ground, the exposure, the risk of falling with no cover and no help, then the solution was not more wood. The solution was less distance, or rather covered distance, protected distance, a passage, a walkway, a narrow, roofed structure connecting the cabin door to the woodshed door. 50 feet, 3 feet wide, tall enough to walk upright, roofed with poles and bark, walls packed with moss to block the wind, floor laid with rough slabs to give traction when everything outside turned to ice. It would not be a house. It would not be a barn. It would be a throat, a narrow throat through winter that let her reach the fuel without exposing herself to the killing, open ground. She began to count. 50 feet of posts, 50 feet of roof poles, 50 feet of bark sheeting, moss for the walls, slabs for the floor, pegs or nails for the joins. The math was not impossible. It was not easy, but it was not impossible. The timber was there. The bark could be stripped from deadfall. The moss grew thick in the low places near the creek. The labor was the question. Could one woman, with one boy, build 50 feet of covered passage before the first hard freeze? Could she do it alone, with $21, with everything else that needed doing? She did not know, but she knew one thing. If she could not build a way to reach the wood did not matter. Marta Iverson came by the next afternoon. Marta was 43 years old, the wife of a farmer whose property sat a quarter-mile down the track. She had raised 5 children in Wisconsin and buried one. She knew what winter meant. She had brought a loaf of bread and a small crock of lard, the kind of gifts neighbors brought to widows in the weeks after funerals. Ragna accepted the gifts at the door. Nels watched from behind her, silent. I heard Elias came by, Marta said. He did. He told the Lindqvist boys you have less than 2 cords and a cabin that bleeds heat. Ragna said nothing. Marta looked past her at the woodshed across the yard. He is not wrong about the distance. 50 feet in a storm is bad walking. 50 feet on ice is worse. I know. So what are you going to do? Ragna hesitated. She had not told anyone about the idea yet. Speaking it aloud would make it real. Speaking it aloud would also invite the kind of judgment she was not sure she could bear. But Marta was looking at her with something that was not quite pity, something closer to curiosity. And Ragna needed someone to know, if only so the idea would exist outside her own head. I am going to build a passage, she said. Marta's eyebrows rose. A what? A covered walkway, from the cabin to the woodshed, roofed, walled, floored, 50 feet. For a long moment, Marta said nothing. Her face moved through several expressions that Ragna could not quite read. A hallway, Marta finally said. You're going to build a hallway outside to a woodshed. Yes. With what labor? My own. With what timber? What I can cut and haul from the stand on the north edge of the claim. Marta looked at the shed again, then back at Ragna. A roof will shed rain, not save your feet from ice. If snow cannot drift into the path, it cannot melt and refreeze under every footfall, Ragna said. If I keep the floor rough and dry enough, I can move wood without falling. If the root is enclosed, nails can help without exposure. You have thought about this. I have thought about nothing else since Elias left. Marta shook her head slowly. Moss belongs in seams, not in some fancy corridor. You're talking about wasting straight timber on a structure nobody builds. You need fencing. You need your north wall chinked. You need more wood split and stacked, not more poles standing in the yard. If I cannot reach the wood, I stack. The stacking does not matter. And if you waste your timber on a hallway to nowhere, you freeze anyway. Ragna felt heat rise in her chest. It is not a hallway to nowhere. It is a hallway to the fuel that keeps my son alive. The two women faced each other across the threshold. Marta's expression was hard to read. Not hostile, exactly, but not convinced either. I hope you know what you're doing, Marta finally said, because nobody else is going to build it for you, and nobody is going to cry for you if it fails. She turned and walked back down the track without another word. The news spread faster than Ragna expected. Within 3 days, it seemed like everyone within 10 miles knew that the Halvorsen widow was building a hallway for firewood. The phrase moved through the settlement like a joke with legs, passed from mouth to mouth in the store, at the mill, in the yards where men gathered to talk about weather and crops and the latest foolishness. A hallway for kindling, one man said. A church aisle for logs, another said. She's building a house for the walk to the house, a third said, and the laughter that followed was loud enough that Ragna heard about it secondhand, from a girl who came to buy eggs and could not stop giggling. She kept working. She had started marking the post line the morning after Marta's visit, string pulled tight between stakes. 3 feet wide, measured with a stick she had cut to length. 50 feet long, measured by pacing. Nels helped. He was 8 years old, skinny as a rail, with his father's jaw and his mother's silence. He did not ask why they were doing this. He did not ask if it would work. He just handed her the stakes when she asked, held the string when she needed it held, and watched with dark eyes that saw more than he said. The first posts went in on the 3rd day. She had cut them herself, peeled saplings from the north stand, straight enough to serve, thick enough to hold weight. The holes were the hard part. The ground was not frozen yet, but it was packed dense from summer drought, and every hole took an hour of work with a spade and an iron bar. By the end of the first week, she had 8 posts in the ground, 42 to go. Silas Vick came by on the 9th day. Ragna saw him coming down the track and felt her stomach tighten. Vick was 51 years old, the owner of the general store in town, the holder of notes on a dozen claims in the county. He was not a large man, but he carried himself like one, chest forward, chin up, eyes that measured everything they landed on. He had a reputation for fairness in business, but fairness in Vick's world meant charging exactly what the market would bear and not a penny less. He had also been buying claims from settlers who failed. Everyone knew it. A family would struggle through one bad winter, fall behind on their notes, and by spring Vick would own their improvements for a third of what they had put into them. He called it helping people out of difficult situations. Others called it something else. He stopped 10 feet from where Ragna was working, setting another post. Mrs. Halvorsen, he said. She straightened up, but did not set down the mallet. I heard you were building something unusual. Did you? A covered walkway. He let the words hang in the air, as if testing their weight. To your woodshed. That is correct. Vick looked at the line of posts stretching across the yard. 8 set, 8 more lying on the ground waiting to be planted. Stripped poles stacked near the cabin. Bark sheets leaned against the woodshed wall, peeled from deadfall and drying in the last of the autumn sun. That is a lot of timber for a hallway, he said. It is the timber I have. Timber that could be sold, bark that could be sold, poles that could go toward something more practical. Ragna tightened her grip on the mallet. What I build is my concern. What you owe is my concern. Vic's voice did not change pitch, but something in it hardened. You have $14 against your name in my ledger. Seed, iron goods, a saw blade your husband bought in July and never paid for. I have been patient because of your loss, but patience has limits. I will pay what I owe. With what? You have no crop to sell. Your husband left no savings anyone knows of. You are spending your labor on a structure that produces nothing. He gestured at the post line. First a widow loses a husband, then she loses good sense. Ragna felt Nels stiffen beside her. The boy had come to stand at her elbow, hands clenched at his sides. My good sense is my own business, Ragna said. Your good sense becomes my business when it affects your ability to settle your debts. Vic reached into his coat and produced a small notebook. I came to make an offer. I'll buy your standing timber, the poles you've cut, the bark you've stripped, the saplings still on the stump in the north stand, 32 cents per cord length of pole, 8 cents per sheet of stripped bark. He paused to let her do the math. It was a bad offer. She knew it. He knew she knew it. That would give you enough to clear your debt and put something aside for winter supplies, Vic said. Lamp oil, flour, things that actually keep people alive. And it would leave me with nothing to build. You have nothing to build that matters. A hallway to a woodshed. He let out a small sound that was almost a laugh. The men in town are calling it the Halverson Folly. Some of them are placing bets on whether you will finish before you freeze. Ragna felt the heat rise from her chest to her face. They think you are mad, Vic said. I think you are desperate, which is worse. Desperation makes people do foolish things with resources they cannot afford to waste. Is there something else you need, Mr. Vic? He studied her for a long moment. Behind the shopkeeper's polish, something calculated moved in his eyes, the same look Ragna had seen in the faces of men who bought struggling cattle, knowing the seller had no choice. I need you to understand your position, he said finally. You are a woman alone with a child, with debts, with winter coming, and you are using your last good timber to build something that makes every practical person in 20 miles laugh. When this fails, and it will fail, I will be here, and my offer will be lower. He tipped his hat, turned, and walked back toward the track. Ragna watched him go. Her hands were shaking. She set down the mallet before Nels could see. Mama, Nels said quietly. He's wrong. I know, Ragna said, but the words felt hollow, even to her. After Vic left, Ragna stood in the yard for a long time, looking at the line of posts stretching across the open ground. 8 posts. Barely a beginning. She needed 50. She needed poles for the roof, bark for the covering, moss for the walls, slabs for the floor. She needed nails or pegs for 1,000 joins. She needed to finish before the ground froze too hard to dig, before the bark curled too dry to lay flat, before the first hard storm made the distance between cabin and woodshed into a death trap. She needed all of this, and she was one woman with bleeding hands and a boy who should have been in school. The laughter of the settlement echoed in her mind. The Halverson Folly. Was she mad? She thought about her father again, the covered walkway on the farm in the old country, the way he had tapped the walls and spoken about distance and cold and the passages that let people survive. Her father had not been a dreamer. He had been the most practical man she had ever known, a man who measured twice, cut once, and never wasted a nail. If he had shown her that passage, if he had spoken those words, there had been a reason. The deadliest distance in winter is the distance with no roof over it. Ragna picked up the mallet. She looked at the ninth post lying on the ground. She had $21. She had a boy who needed her. She had a structure that everyone said was foolish and a winter coming that would test everything she had built. She started digging. The work continued. By the end of the second week, she had 20 posts in the ground. The line stretched clear across the yard now, a skeletal promise of what might become a passage if she could finish in time. The labor was harder than she had imagined. Every post meant a hole. Every hole meant an hour or more of digging, leveling, tamping. Every post had to be straight, had to be plumb, had to be set deep enough that frost would not heave it loose. Her hands blistered, then calloused, then cracked. Her shoulders ached from hauling poles. Her back seized at night, and she lay awake listening to her own body complain. Nels worked beside her when he could. He gathered moss from the low places near the creek, filling burlap sacks until his fingers turned green with the stuff. He carried bark sheets from the drying stack to the work site, small loads that he could manage without dropping. He counted pegs, held measuring sticks, fetched water when her throat went dry. He did not complain, not once. At night, after Nels was asleep, Ragna sat by the stove and counted what they had done against what remained to do. The math never balanced. There was always too much work and too little time, too few hands and too many posts still to plant. But she kept going. 20 posts became 25. 25 became 30. The first roof poles went up in the third week, laid crosswise across the standing posts, lashed tight with strips of bark that would have to be replaced with pegs when she had the time. The structure began to take shape, a narrow framework stretching across the yard, like the skeleton of some strange animal. Neighbors came by to look. Most of them did not stop to speak. They just slowed as they passed, stared at the framework, shook their heads, and kept going. Ragna learned to ignore them. She learned to keep her eyes on the work, her hands on the tools, her mind on the next post, the next pole, the next piece of bark that needed cutting or stripping or laying. She could not afford to look up. Looking up meant seeing how far she had to go. The first setback came in the fourth week. A squall blew in from the northwest, not a true winter storm, but a hard slap of wind and sleet that lasted 2 hours and left everything glazed with a thin skin of ice. Ragna was inside the cabin when it hit, watching through the window as the sky turned gray and angry. When she went out after the squall passed, she found the damage. 6 sheets of bark she had stripped and dried and stacked against the woodshed wall were warped. The sleet had soaked through the top of the stack, and the bark had curled as it froze. She tried to flatten one of the sheets with her hands. It cracked down the middle. 6 sheets, a day's work to strip them, a week's drying time, gone. She stood in the yard with the ruined bark at her feet and felt something crack inside her, too. This was not going to work. The people who laughed at her were right. She was a woman alone with a child, building something no one built, against a deadline no one could see and no one could extend. She was going to fail. She was going to freeze. Her boy was going to freeze. The thought was so clear, so certain, that for a moment she could not move. Then she heard Nels's voice behind her. "Mama?" She turned. He was standing in the cabin doorway, wrapped in a blanket too thin for the cold, his face pale, his eyes fixed on the ruined bark. "Are we going to lose?" he asked. The question hit her like a physical blow. She looked at her son, 8 years old, motherless in all the ways that mattered, his father 3 months dead, and his life depending on whether she could build a hallway through winter. "No," she said. The word came out harder than she intended, louder. "No," she said again, quieter this time. "We are not going to lose." She picked up the ruined bark and carried it to the scrap pile. Then she walked to the north stand to strip more. The weather held for another week. 30 posts became 40. The roof poles multiplied. The first sections of bark went up on the west wall, overlapping from bottom to top so the rain would run down instead of in. Gaps appeared between the bark sheets where she had cut too short or measured wrong, and she filled them with packed moss pressed into the seams. The passage was beginning to look like something real. Not finished, nowhere close to finished, but real. A structure with shape and purpose, stretching from the cabin door toward the woodshed like a reaching hand. At night, Ragna walked the length of it in her mind, imagining the finished route, the roof overhead, the walls blocking the wind, the floor rough with ash and slab, giving traction when everything outside turned to glass. She imagined herself making the trip 100 times, 1,000 times, arms full of split birch, the cold unable to touch her because she had built a way through it. The image kept her going. It had to, because the temperature was dropping. The nights were getting longer. The first hard frost was coming, and she still had 10 posts to plant, 20 feet of roof to lay, half the walls to pack with moss, and a floor that existed only in her mind. She worked faster. Her hands cracked and bled. Her shoulders screamed. Nels coughed at night now, a wet sound that made her lie awake listening, counting the hours until dawn. 40 posts became 45. The woodshed end of the passage took shape. The roof stretched almost all the way across the yard now. The walls were half-packed, the bark sheeting 3/4 complete, the floor still nothing but packed earth and hope. She was so close. She was so close, and there was so little time. And then Torsten Vale appeared. Ragna did not see him arrive. She was up a ladder, trying to secure a roof pole that had shifted in the night, when she heard a voice behind her. "Your post spacing is too wide." She nearly fell. She caught herself on the pole, turned, and saw a man standing at the edge of the passage framework, studying the structure with his head tilted to one side. He was old, 60 at least, maybe more. His face was weathered to the color of seasoned oak, creased with lines that mapped a lifetime of work and cold. His hands, hanging at his sides, were thick and gnarled, the kind of hands that had shaped wood for decades. He wore a coat that had been patched so many times it was impossible to guess its original color. "Who are you?" Ragna asked. "Torsten Vale." He did not offer his hand, did not step closer. He just kept looking at the framework. "I cut shingles for the Lindqvist mill until my back told me to stop. Before that, I framed timber camps along the Chippewa for 15 years. Before that, I built whatever needed building in Telemark until the forest there played out." Ragna climbed down from the ladder slowly, watching him. "Your post spacing is too wide," Torsten said again. 8 inches apart at the base, maybe, but they bow inward at the top. An ice load will push them together. The roof will sag. If it sags enough, it falls. I set them as straight as I could. Straight is not the same as braced. He walked to the nearest post and pressed his palm against it, the same way Elias had pressed against the cabin wall weeks before. But where Elias had been judging her failure, this man seemed to be measuring something else. "Your wind direction is right," Torsten said. Ragna blinked. "What?" "The bark overlap. You laid it so the prevailing wind pushes water down the seams instead of under them. Someone taught you that." "My father." Torsten nodded slowly, as if this explained something. "Was he a builder?" "He was a timber hand in Norway. He showed me things." Torsten was quiet for a moment. Then he walked the length of the passage, all 45 feet of it, running his hands along the posts, tapping the roof poles, pressing his fingers into the moss-packed seams. Ragna watched him, her heart beating hard, waiting for the verdict she had heard from everyone else. He reached the end, turned, and walked back. "You're not building a house," he said. "No." "You're not even building a shed." "No." "You are building a root." Ragna felt something loosen in her chest. Someone understood. "Yes," she said. "I am building a root." Torsten studied her face for a long moment. Whatever he saw there, he seemed to reach some kind of decision. "Your post spacing is too wide," he said for the third time, "and your roof pitch is too steep. You want the ice to shed, but if it sheds too fast, it takes the bark with it. You need to lower the pitch and tighten the purlins." "I do not know how to do that." "I know," Torsten said. "That is why I am going to show you." Torsten Vale did not offer charity. He did not speak of pity or Christian duty, or the obligations neighbors owed to widows. He spoke of load and pitch, and the way ice behaved when it accumulated on a surface that was not designed to shed it. "Watch," he said. He had brought tools with him, a hand drill, a draw knife, a small hatchet with a handle worn smooth by decades of use. He selected one of the roof poles Ragna had already laid, gripped it at both ends, and twisted. The pole shifted in its lashing, moving more than it should have. "Feel that?" he asked. "It moves." "It moves because you lashed it instead of pegging it. Lashing stretches when it gets wet. Pegging does not." He reached into his coat and produced a handful of wooden pegs, each one about 4 inches long, tapered to a point. "You drill a hole through the pole and into the post below. Then you drive the peg. The wood swells when it gets wet, which makes the joint tighter, not looser." He demonstrated on the nearest joint, drilling, inserting the peg, driving it home with 3 sharp blows of the hatchet handle. When he was done, he gripped the pole and twisted again. It did not move. "Now it will hold an ice load," he said. "Before it would not." Ragna watched his hands as he worked. They were old hands, spotted with age, the knuckles swollen and the fingers slightly bent, but they moved with a certainty that came from doing the same motions 10,000 times. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. Torsten did not look up from the joint he was checking. "I am not helping you. I am correcting you. There is a difference." "What is the difference?" "Helping means doing the work for you. Correcting means showing you where your work is wrong so you can fix it yourself." He straightened up and met her eyes. "I saw what you are building. I saw that you understand something most people here do not understand. The distance is the danger. The route is the solution. You're not wrong about that. But I am wrong about how to build it. You're wrong about some things, right about others." He gestured at the bark overlap on the west wall. "That is right. That is good work. The post spacing is wrong. The roof pitch is wrong. The purlin spacing is wrong. Those things can be fixed. Can they be fixed in time?" Torsten looked at the sky. It was gray, heavy with moisture, the kind of sky that promised weather without specifying what kind. "That depends on how fast you learn," he said. The lessons came quickly after that. Torsten appeared every day for the next 2 weeks, arriving at first light and leaving at dusk. He did not stay in the cabin. He did not eat their food. He came to work, and when the work was done for the day, he went back to wherever he slept. A room in town, Ragna eventually learned, rented by the week from a widow who needed the income. He taught through demonstration, not lecture. When he wanted her to understand something, he showed her. When she made a mistake, he showed her again. He rarely raised his voice. He rarely praised. But when she got something right, he nodded once, and that nod felt like more approval than words could carry. The first lesson was about load. Ice is heavier than snow, Torsten said. A foot of snow weighs maybe 4 pounds per square foot. An inch of ice weighs 5 pounds per square foot. You can have a roof that holds snow all winter and collapses under the first ice storm. He showed her how to calculate load, how to look at a roof section and estimate how much weight it could bear before the supports failed. He showed her how to add diagonal bracing to the posts, short poles cut at angles and pegged into place, turning a line of posts into a rigid frame that could resist lateral pressure. The ice does not just push down, he said. It pushes sideways. The wind pushes sideways. If your posts cannot resist sideways force, they will fold like a man's legs when his knees give out. The second lesson was about pitch. What? Too steep, and the water runs off too fast. It takes the bark with it, strips it right off the roof poles. Too shallow, and the water pools. It freezes. The ice builds up. Eventually the weight breaks the roof. He showed her the angle he recommended, not measured with instruments, but judged by eye and tested by feel. He laid a straight edge across the roof poles and adjusted until the angle satisfied him. There, he said, that will shed ice without stripping bark. That will let water run without letting it pool. The third lesson was about moisture. Moss is good for air, Torsten said. It is not good for water. If the moss gets wet and stays wet, it rots. If it rots, it loses its spring. If it loses its spring, it stops blocking wind. He showed her how to protect the moss-packed seams with interior slats, thin strips of wood pegged over the moss, creating a barrier that kept rain from soaking through while still allowing the moss to do its work. The slat takes the water, he said. The moss takes the air. Together, they take the winter. The work accelerated. With Torsten's guidance, Ragna rebuilt the weak sections of the framework. She replaced lash joints with pegged ones. She added diagonal bracing to every fourth post. She adjusted the roof pitch, lowering it by the width of her palm across the 50-foot span. She installed slats over the moss-packed seams, protecting them from the rain that was coming more frequently now as autumn deepened. The passage began to look less like a skeleton and more like a structure. 45 posts became 50. The roof stretched all the way from the cabin door to the woodshed door, a continuous line of poles and bark that shed water when the rain came. The walls rose on both sides, packed tight with moss, reinforced with slats, blocking the wind that tried to knife through. The floor was the last piece. You need traction, Torsten said. Ice forms on any surface that gets wet. If your floor gets wet and freezes, you will fall. If you fall inside the passage, you are better off than if you fall outside, but only if you can get up again. He showed her how to lay rough slabs with the grain running crosswise, creating ridges that would catch a boot sole. He showed her how to scatter ash over the slabs, creating a gritty surface that would grip even when wet. He showed her how to build up the thresholds at both ends, creating small dams that would keep meltwater from running into the passage and pooling on the floor. The floor is not beautiful, Torsten said when they were done. It does not need to be beautiful. It needs to keep you on your feet. Ragna walked the length of the passage for the first time on the last day of October. 50 feet of covered route from her cabin door to her woodshed door. The roof was rough, the walls were rougher, and the floor was roughest of all. But she walked it upright, without bending, without exposure, without the wind touching her face. When she reached the woodshed door, she turned and walked back. Nels was standing at the cabin end, watching her. "Does it work?" he asked. "I do not know yet," Ragna said, "but it stands." Elias Broder came back 3 days later. He walked the post line from outside, not entering the passage, studying the framework with the same critical eye he had brought to the cabin inspection 2 months before. When he reached the woodshed end, he turned and studied it from the other direction. Ragna waited at the cabin door. Nels beside her. You finished it, Elias said. I did. With help. He glanced at Torsten, who was sitting on a stump near the scrap pile, sharpening a draw knife. With teaching, Ragnar corrected. Elias walked closer to the structure. He reached out and pressed his palm against one of the posts, the same gesture he had used on the cabin wall. This time he held it there for a long moment, feeling for movement. The bracing is good, he said finally. Better than I expected. Torsten showed me. Torsten shows a lot of people things. Most of them do not learn. Elias withdrew his hand and looked at her directly. A light snow will not test this. A rain will not test this. You have built something that will stand in easy weather. Easy weather is not what kills people. I know. The first ice storm will tell you if this works. The first time the yard glazes over and you have to choose between staying inside with no fuel and trusting this thing you built, that is when you will know. I know, Ragnar said again. Elias studied her face for a moment. Whatever he saw there, it did not change his expression. I hope you do, he said, because if this fails, there will be no time to build another one. He left without saying goodbye. November came with cold, not the killing cold of deep winter, but the warning cold that preceded it, frost on the ground each morning, ice skimming the water bucket by dawn, breath visible in the air from the moment Ragna woke until the moment she slept. The passage stood. Light snow came in the second week of November. 2 inches, dry and powdery, the kind of snow that whispered when the wind moved it. Ragna opened the inner door of the passage and looked down the length of it. The roof had caught the snow. Inside, the floor was clear. She made the trip to the woodshed and back, carrying an armload of split birch. The passage was dim. No windows, only the light that leaked through the gaps in the bark, but her feet knew the floor now. She did not stumble. She did not slip. When she came back inside the cabin, Nels was waiting. The snow did not get in, he said. No, it did not. A week later, rain came. Hard rain driven sideways by a wind that would have soaked her to the skin in 30 seconds of open walking. She made the trip to the woodshed through the passage, listening to the rain drum on the roof above her, feeling the floor stay dry beneath her boots. When she came back, she was not wet. Marta Iverson stopped by the next day. I saw you crossing to the shed in that storm, Marta said. I saw you come back dry. The passage works. In rain. Marta's voice was careful, measured. Rain is not ice. Rain is not the weight that breaks roofs. You have not faced a real test yet. I know. Do you? Marta looked at the passage, her expression unreadable. My husband says you have built something clever. He also says clever is not the same as strong. Clever fails when conditions get hard enough. Then I will find out when conditions get hard enough. Marta was quiet for a moment. Then she reached into the basket she was carrying and pulled out a bundle wrapped in cloth. Grain sacks, she said. Old ones. Too worn for hauling, but the cloth is still good. If you line the draftiest sections of your walls with these, they will block wind better than moss alone. Ragna looked at the bundle, then at Marta's face. I thought you said this was foolish. I said it might be foolish. I did not say I wanted you to freeze. Marta set the bundle on the ground. Line the north wall first. That is where the wind hits hardest. She left before Ragna could thank her. December came with teeth. The temperature dropped. The snow came more frequently now, heavier, wetter, the kind of snow that packed instead of drifted. The passage collected it on the roof and shed it off the sides, just as Torsten had designed. The floor stayed clear. The walls held. Ragna made the trip to the woodshed and back 12 times a day, feeding the stove that kept her cabin warm, keeping the fire alive that kept her son alive. Each trip took less than a minute. Each trip stayed dry, but she could feel the winter tightening around them like a fist. The wood supply was better than it had been in October. Torsten had helped her haul and split 3 more cords from the north stand, working beside her with an energy that belied his age. The shed now held close to 5 cords, not the 8 Elias had recommended, but more than the 2 she had started with. 5 cords. If she was careful, if the winter was not too brutal, it might be enough. But careful meant nothing if she could not reach the wood. And the test she had been dreading was coming. She could feel it in the air, a wet heaviness that pressed down on the settlement like a hand. The old-timers in town talked about it in the store, shaking their heads, remembering other winters when the sky had felt this way before the ice came. "Freezing rain," one of them said. "Mark my words, before January's out, we will see a glaze that locks everything down." Ragna heard the words and felt her stomach tighten. Freezing rain. The test Elias had predicted. The weight that Marta had warned about. The condition that would tell her whether what she had built was clever or strong, or both, or neither. She went home and checked every joint in the passage. She tightened every peg. She added more ash to the floor. She lined the north wall with Marta's grain sacks, pressing them tight against the moss. Then she waited. Nels got sick in the 2nd week of January. It started as a cough, dry at first, then wet, the kind of cough that came from deep in the chest and left him gasping. Ragna kept him in bed, kept the cabin warm, fed him broth made from the last of the salt pork she had been saving. His fever came on the 14th. She felt it when she touched his forehead in the morning, heat radiating from his skin like a stove door left open. His eyes were glassy, unfocused. When he spoke, his words slurred together. "Mama," he said, "I am cold." She piled blankets on him. She fed the stove until the cabin was almost too hot to breathe. She sat beside him through the day, watching his chest rise and fall, counting the seconds between each breath. The fever did not break. By the night of the 16th, she had burned through half a cord of wood. The stove was eating fuel faster than she had planned, faster than the math allowed. If Nels stayed sick, if the fever held, she would run through her reserves in a week. She looked at the window. The sky was gray, heavy, pressing down. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow she would need to make more trips to the shed. Tomorrow she would need to haul more wood than usual, enough to keep the fire high, enough to fight the fever that was eating her son from the inside. Tomorrow. She did not know that tomorrow would bring the ice. The rain started before noon on January 17th, 1887. Ragna heard it first, a sound like fingers tapping on the roof. Soft at first, then harder. She went to the window and looked out. The yard was gray with moisture, the air thick with falling water, but it was not normal rain. She watched a drop hit the ground and freeze on contact. She watched another drop hit the fence rail and turn to glass before her eyes. She watched the world outside her window begin to glaze over, one drop at a time, as the temperature held just below freezing and the rain kept falling. By mid-afternoon, the fence rails were bowed under the weight of accumulated ice. The tree branches were drooping, some of them already snapping, the sound like distant gunshots that made Nels flinch in his fever sleep. By dusk, the yard was a skating rink. Rana opened the cabin door and looked out. The distance between her and the woodshed, 50 feet of open ground, was a sheet of solid ice. She could see her reflection in it. She could see the sky reflected in it. She could see that anyone who tried to walk that distance would go down before they reached the other side. She looked to her left. The passage stood. Ice coated the roof. Ice coated the walls. Ice hung from the eaves in small curtains, glinting in the fading light. But the structure had not collapsed. The roof had not sagged. The bracing Torsten had taught her to install was holding. She stepped to the inner door of the passage, the door she had cut through the cabin wall and fitted with hinges salvaged from a broken trunk, and opened it. Inside, the passage was dark, cold, but passable. She took a step, then another. The floor was rough beneath her boots, the slabs with their crosswise grain, the scattered ash, the surfaces that Torsten had designed to give traction when everything else turned to glass. She walked the length of the passage without falling. At the woodshed door, she paused. The outer latch was stiff with ice, but not frozen shut. The small roof overhang she had added protected it from the worst of the accumulation. She worked the latch loose and opened the door. Inside the shed, the wood was dry. The split birch was stacked against the back wall, pale and waiting. She filled her apron with as much as she could carry, closed the shed door, and walked back through the passage. Inside the cabin, Nels was coughing. She fed the stove. The night was long. The rain stopped around midnight, but the temperature did not rise. Everything that had glazed over stayed glazed. Ragna could hear the ice creaking on the roof of the passage, settling under its own weight. She could hear branches cracking in the woods behind the cabin, the sound of trees giving up limbs they had carried for decades. Nels's fever held. He drifted in and out of sleep, sometimes lucid, sometimes murmuring words she could not understand. She kept the fire high, kept the water warm, kept wiping his face with damp cloths. Twice in the night, she made the trip to the woodshed. The passage held. The floor stayed dry. The walls blocked the wind that was rising now, gusting across the frozen yard with a force that would have knocked her down if she had been walking in the open. The roof creaked but did not sag. The ice accumulated on top of it, but the pitch Torsten had taught her, not too steep, not too shallow, let it shed in slow slides that landed outside the walls. By dawn, Ragna had burned through most of the wood she had brought inside the previous day. She needed more. The morning of January 18th was a world made of glass. Ragna opened the cabin door and looked out at a landscape she barely recognized. Every surface was coated. The fence rails were bowed nearly to the ground under the weight. The trees were encased in crystal, their branches hanging low, some of them already touching the earth. The yard itself was a mirror, reflecting the gray sky above. She could see her neighbor's cabin half a mile away, the Lindqvist place, and she could see smoke still rising from the chimney. But she could also see figures moving in the yard, struggling, falling, getting up only to fall again. She could hear a sound that might have been shouting or crying. She turned and looked at the passage. Ice covered every inch of it. The structure looked like something from a fairy tale, glittering and strange. But beneath the ice, the posts were still standing. The roof was still in place. The walls were still solid. She had to know. She stepped to the inner door and opened it. Cold air rushed out, colder than the cabin, but not as cold as outside. She stepped into the passage and pulled the door closed behind her. Darkness. The ice on the roof was thick enough to block most of the light. She could barely see the walls on either side of her, could barely see the floor beneath her feet, but she could feel the floor. Rough, gritty with ash, solid. She walked, 1 step, 2, 3. The walls brushed her shoulders on both sides. She had built it narrow, 3 feet wide, just enough room to walk with an armload of wood. The narrowness felt different now, comforting instead of confining. The walls held her upright. If she stumbled, she could catch herself before she fell. 10 steps, 20. The passage was dark, but her feet knew the way. She had walked this route 100 times. 1,000 times. The distance that had seemed so dangerous in October was familiar now, worn into her body like a path worn into earth. 30 steps. 40. The woodshed door. She reached for the latch. It was stiff, stiffer than the night before, but it gave. She opened the door and light flooded in, gray and cold, reflecting off the ice that coated everything. The wood was there, dry, waiting. She filled her apron. She filled a basket she had left in the shed for this purpose. She loaded herself with as much as she could carry and still walk. Then she walked back. She made the trip 7 times that morning. Each time the passage held. Each time the floor stayed dry. The walls stayed standing. The roof stayed in place. Ice accumulated on the outside, adding weight, adding pressure. But the bracing held. The pitch held. The pegs Torsten had taught her to use instead of lashings held. The passage was being tested, and it was passing. But the cabin was not the only place in the settlement that needed heat. Marta arrived at midday, half dragging her youngest daughter. The girl was 7 years old, her face pale, her lips blue, her body shaking with cold that had gotten into her bones. Marta's own face was streaked with tears that had frozen on her cheeks. "Our fire is out," Marta said. Her voice was ragged, exhausted. "The wood is across the yard. Arna tried to reach it. He fell. He fell 3 times. The last time he did not get up." "Where is he now?" "Inside, on the floor. I cannot move him. I cannot reach the wood. I cannot." Marta's voice broke. "I cannot keep her warm." Ragna looked at the girl. Then she looked at the passage. "Bring her inside," she said. She led Marta through the cabin to the stove, helped her settle the girl on the floor near the heat, piled blankets over her small body. Then she went to the passage. "What are you doing?" Marta asked. "Getting kindling." She walked the passage to the woodshed, loaded herself with dry split birch, and walked back. She handed the wood to Marta. "Take this, go home, start your fire again. When you have it going, come back for more." Marta stared at her. "How did you— the yard is ice. How did you—" "The passage," Ragna said. "It works." Word spread. By the afternoon of January 18th, 3 more families had come to Ragna's door. Their stories were all the same. Wood across the yard, ice on the ground, no way to reach the fuel without falling. One man had a broken wrist from trying. Another had a gash on his head that was still bleeding sluggishly, frozen blood crusted in his hair. Ragna gave them wood. She made the trip to the shed again and again, loading herself with as much as she could carry, walking the passage that everyone had mocked, bringing dry fuel to people who had laughed at the idea of building a hallway for firewood. The word they were using now was different. The Halverson Run, one of them called it, the covered way. "The route," another said. She built a route. Ragna did not stop to listen. She kept walking. Nels was still sick, still burning with fever, and every trip to the shed meant time away from his side. But she could not let the others freeze. She could not watch their children turn blue while dry wood sat 50 feet away, untouchable behind a wall of ice. She made the trip, and made it again, and made it again. The crash came at dusk. Ragna was in the passage, halfway between the cabin and the shed, when she heard it, a sound like a cannon shot, followed by a long, splintering groan. The walls shook. The roof shook. For one terrible moment, she thought the whole structure was coming down. She froze, arms wrapped around an armload of birch, heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her teeth. Another groan, a crack, a thud that shook the floor beneath her feet. Then silence. She forced herself to move. One step, another. She reached the cabin end of the passage and pushed through the inner door. Nels was awake, sitting up in bed, eyes wide. "What was that?" he asked. "I do not know. Stay inside." She set down the wood and went back into the passage. She walked its length slowly, running her hands along the walls, feeling for damage. Near the woodshed end, she found it. A branch, a massive limb from the oak that stood just beyond the shed, had fallen across the roof. She could see it through a gap in the bark sheeting, a dark shape coated in ice, lying across the passage like a fallen giant. The roof had cracked beneath it. One of the poles had snapped. Bark sheets had been driven inward, creating a gap where cold air was already pouring through. But the walls had not collapsed. The posts had not folded. The diagonal bracing Torsten had taught her to install was holding the structure together even with a 100-pound limb lying on top of it. The passage was damaged, but it was not destroyed. Ragna stared at the gap, at the ice-covered branch, at the cold air flowing through. Then she went back to the cabin, got a hammer and some nails, and started patching. The thaw came on the 20th of January. Ragna woke to a sound she had not heard in 3 days, water dripping. She went to the window and saw the ice beginning to release its grip on the world. The fence rails were straightening as the weight lifted. The tree branches were rising. The yard was still glazed, but the glaze was melting, turning from a mirror into a puddle. Nels's fever had broken in the night. He was weak, pale, hungry, but his eyes were clear and his skin was cool. "Mama," he said when she came to check on him. "Is it over?" "The storm is over," Ragna said. "The winter is not." But she smiled when she said it. The settlement counted its losses over the next week. Arne Iverson had cracked 2 ribs in his falls on the ice. He would heal, but he would not be cutting wood for a month. The bachelor settler, 2 miles north, a man named Gruber, had broken his wrist badly enough that the bone came through the skin. The doctor in town said he might keep the hand and he might not. Worst of all was the Henriksen boy. He was 12 years old, the oldest son of a family that lived on the far edge of the settlement. He had tried to cross 50 feet of open ice to reach his family's woodpile. He had fallen. He had hit his head. By the time his father reached him, dragging himself across the ice on his belly, the boy was not breathing. They buried him 3 days after the thaw in ground that had to be broken with picks because the frost went down 2 feet. Ragna went to the funeral. She stood at the edge of the grave, watching the small coffin go into the ground, thinking about 50 feet. 50 feet that she had crossed 100 times during the storm. 50 feet that had killed a boy who did not have a roof over them. The passage had held. Her son was alive. Her fire had never gone out, but the Henriksen boy was dead. Elias Broder came by on the first day of February. He walked the length of the passage, inside this time, running his hands along the walls the way Torsten had done. He stopped at the place where the branch had fallen, where the patched roof still showed the scar of the impact. He studied the repair, the way the new poles had been pegged in, the way the bark had been overlapped to seal the gap. When he came out, his face was different than it had been in October. "I counted your timber wrong," he said. Ragna waited. "I told you the walk would kill you. I told you the distance was the danger. I was right about that, but I was wrong about the solution." He looked at the passage, at the rough walls, at the roof that had held an ice storm and a falling limb and the weight of everything winter could throw at it. "I thought you were wasting logs on foolishness. I thought you were building a hallway to nowhere." "I was building a route," Ragna said. "You were building a route," Elias agreed, "and the route saved more wood than it spent." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small bundle, a handful of iron hinges, better quality than anything Ragna had been able to afford. "For the doors," he said. "The ones you have will rust by spring. These will not. He set the hinges on the ground and walked away. Ragna watched him go. Then she picked up the hinges and went inside to check on Nels. The thaw did not last. By mid-February, the cold had returned, and with it came snow, deep, heavy, the kind that piled against walls and buried fences and made every trip outside a negotiation with the weather. But the passage stood, and Ragna walked it daily, and the fire in her cabin never went out. Word of what had happened during the ice storm spread through the settlement like smoke through a drafty cabin. People talked about it in the store, at the mill, in the yards where men gathered to discuss the winter and its costs. They talked about the Henriksen boy who had died crossing 50 feet of open ice. They talked about Arna Iverson's cracked ribs and Gruber's ruined wrist. And they talked about the Halverson widow, who had walked her covered passage 100 times while the world outside turned to glass. The tone had changed. No one called it the Halverson folly anymore. Marta Iverson came back on the 3rd day of February, alone this time, without her daughter, without the desperate look she had worn during the storm. She stood at the entrance to the passage and looked at it for a long time before she spoke. "I want to understand how you build it," she said. Ragna set down the axe she had been using to split kindling. "Why?" "Because Arne cannot cross our yard safely, not with his ribs, not until spring, maybe longer, and we have wood stacked behind the barn that we cannot reach when the weather turns bad." Marta's voice was careful, measured, the voice of a woman who had spent her whole life being practical and was now asking for something that had seemed impractical until 3 weeks ago. "I want to build one, or something like one, a covered way from our back door to the barn." "That is a longer distance than mine." "I know. That is why I need to understand how you did it." Ragna looked at the passage, then at Marta, the woman who had brought grain sacks and skepticism in equal measure, the woman who had said moss belonged in seams, not fancy corridors, the woman who had come to her door during the storm, half dragging a freezing child, because her own yard had become impassable. "Come inside," Ragna said. "I will show you." The lesson took most of the afternoon. Ragna walked Marta through the passage section by section, explaining the choices she had made and why. She showed her the post spacing tighter than it looked, braced with diagonal supports. She showed her the roof pitch, shallow enough to shed ice without stripping bark. She showed her the moss-packed walls with their protective slats, the rough slab floor with its crosswise grain, the ash scattered for traction. "The floor is the part most people forget," Ragna said. "They think about keeping weather out. They do not think about keeping their feet under them." Marta ran her hand along the wall, feeling the moss beneath the slats. "Where did you learn this?" "Some from my father, some from Torsten Vale, some from making mistakes and fixing them." "Torsten helped you?" "Torsten taught me. There's a difference." Ragna heard the echo of Torsten's own words in her voice and smiled slightly. "He did not do the work for me. He showed me where my work was wrong." Marta was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Will he teach me?" "You would have to ask him." "I am asking you first, because you are the one who built this. You are the one who walked it while the rest of us fell." The words hung in the cold air of the passage. Ragna heard something in them that she had not expected, not just respect, but something closer to acknowledgement. Marta Iverson, who had raised 5 children and buried 1, who had survived more winters than Ragna had lived years, was asking her for knowledge. "I will teach you what I know," Ragna said, "but I do not know everything. Torsten knows more." "Then teach me what you know, and I will ask Torsten for the rest." The teaching continued over the following weeks. Marta came every few days when her own chores allowed. Ragna showed her how to select posts straight enough to stand true, thick enough to bear weight, small enough to handle alone. She showed her how to dig post holes in frozen ground, a brutal task that required an iron bar, a pickaxe, and more patience than most people possessed. She showed her how to set posts plumb, how to check alignment by eye, how to brace against lateral pressure. "The wind does not just blow," Ragna said, repeating Torsten's lesson. "It pushes. If your posts cannot resist pushing, they will fold." Marta listened. She asked questions. She took notes in a small book she had brought, writing in a cramped hand that suggested she had not done much writing in her life. By the end of February, she had begun construction on her own covered way, a shorter passage than Ragna's, connecting her back door to the corner of the barn where the firewood was stacked. Arna could not help with the heavy work, but their oldest son could, and Marta directed him with the confidence of someone who had learned the principles and trusted them. "She's building it right," Torsten said when he saw the framework. He had come to check on Ragna's passage after a heavy snow and had walked the half-mile to the Iverson place out of curiosity. "The post spacing is correct. The bracing is correct. She learned from you." "I learned from you," Ragna said. "You learned the methods from me, the understanding you had already." Torsten looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. "Not everyone can teach. Some people know a thing and cannot pass it on. You can pass it on. That is a different kind of knowledge." Others came. A young couple named Dahl, newly married, living in a cabin 3 miles down the road. Their woodshed was only 30 feet from their door, but 30 feet had become 30 feet too far during the ice storm. They had burned furniture to keep warm on the worst night. A widower named Gunderson, 60 years old, with a bad leg that made walking on ice impossible. He had nearly lost his toes to frostbite after crawling across his yard to reach his fuel supply. A family named Thorson, with 4 children under the age of 10. The father had fallen during the storm and cracked his skull on the ice. He was alive, but he saw double now, and the doctor said he might never walk straight again. They came to Ragna's door with the same question Marta had asked. "How did you build it?" Ragna answered. She marked post lines in snow with a stick, the way her father had marked measurements. She demonstrated bark overlap on scraps of wood, showing how water followed the natural curl. She explained the logic of the floor, rough surfaces, crosswise grain, scattered ash, until the visitors nodded and said they understood. Some of them asked if she would come to their properties and help with the construction. She went when she could, when Nels was well enough to be left alone, when her own chores were caught up enough to spare the time. She set posts and hung bark and packed moss into seams, working beside people who had laughed at her 4 months ago. None of them mentioned the laughter now. Silas Vick watched all of this from a distance. Ragna saw him sometimes, passing on the road, stopping to look at the passage with an expression that shifted between calculation and something that might have been resentment. He did not come to her door. He did not ask how she had built it. He did not offer to buy her timber anymore, but she heard things. She heard that Vic had been telling people the ice storm was unusual, a freak event, the kind of thing that happened once in a generation. She heard that he had been suggesting the covered passages were a waste of good lumber, that the money spent on posts and bark would have been better spent on extra cordwood or thicker cabin walls. She heard that fewer people were listening to him than before. "He is afraid," Torsten said one afternoon, when Ragna mentioned what she had heard. They were sitting in her cabin, drinking weak tea, watching Nels practice his letters at the table. "Not of you, of what you represent." What do I represent? A way of thinking he did not predict, a solution he did not control. Torsten set down his cup. Vic makes his money from people who fail. He buys their claims cheap and sells them dear. He holds their notes and waits for them to default. A woman who teaches her neighbors how to survive, that woman costs him money. I am not trying to cost him anything. You do not have to try, you just have to succeed. Torsten's eyes were steady on hers. He will not forgive you for that. Men like Vic never do. The collaboration with Torsten deepened as winter stretched toward spring. They worked together now on projects that went beyond Ragna's own passage. Torsten had ideas, improvements, refinements, variations on the basic design that could serve different purposes. A wider passage for hauling sled loads. A passage with removable wall panels that could be opened in summer to prevent rot. A passage with a branching junction that connected multiple outbuildings to a single protected route. The principle is the same, Torsten said, sketching in the snow with a stick. The application can vary. A route is a route, whether it runs straight or turns a corner. They built a prototype of the branching design on Ragna's property, a short extension from her main passage that led to the chicken coop she had been planning to construct in the spring. The extension was only 12 feet long, but it proved the concept. 3 buildings connected by covered routes, all accessible without exposure to open weather. If you had 4 buildings, Nell said, studying the sketch Torsten had drawn, you could connect them all, like a spider's web. Like a village, Torsten said. A village with no open streets. Ragna looked at the sketch and felt something stir in her chest, a sense of possibility that went beyond survival, beyond merely getting through the winter. She had built a route to save her son. But the route could be more than that. It could be a way of living, a way of building, a way of thinking about the distance between where people were and where they needed to be. We should write it down, she said. Torsten looked at her. Write what down? The methods, the measurements, the principles. She gestured at the passage, at the extension, at the sketch in the snow. If people are going to build these, they need to know how to build them right. Not everyone can come here and learn in person. You want to make a guide. I want to make something that lasts longer than we do. Torsten was quiet for a long moment. Then he smiled, a rare expression on his weathered face, one that made him look younger than his 64 years. Your father taught you more than you know, he said. They argued about the guide. It was the first real disagreement they had had, and it surprised Ragna with its intensity. The conflict was not about whether to write the guide, but about what it should contain. Torsten wanted to include only the proven methods, the techniques he had used for decades, the approaches that had been tested and refined in timber camps and farmsteads across 2 countries. He wanted the guide to be conservative, reliable, safe. Ragna wanted to include the innovations, the branching design, the removable panels, the variations they had developed together. She wanted the guide to show what was possible, not just what was proven. If you tell people to experiment, some of them will fail, Torsten said. They were sitting in the cabin again, the table covered with scraps of paper, where they had been sketching designs. They will build something that looks right and collapses in the first storm. They will blame the method, not their execution. And if we tell them only to copy what exists, they will never improve on it, Ragna said. The covered way I built is not perfect. The one Marta built is not perfect. But they are better than nothing, and the next ones will be better still. Better built by people who understand the principles. Worse built by people who only read the words. Then we write the principles clearly. We explain not just what to do, but why. We trust people to think. Torsten shook his head slowly. You have more faith in people than I do. I have faith in people who are trying to keep their families alive. That kind of desperation makes good students. They stared at each other across the table. Nels had stopped practicing his letters and was watching them with wide eyes, sensing the tension without understanding its source. Finally, Torsten sighed. We will include the innovations, he said, but we will mark them clearly. Proven methods in one section, experimental methods in another. Let people choose their own risk. That is fair. It is a compromise. Torsten's voice was gruff, but the corner of his mouth twitched. I am not accustomed to compromise. You are a difficult woman to argue with. I learned from a difficult man. The guide took shape over the following weeks. Torsten dictated while Ragna wrote. Her handwriting was clearer than his, her spelling more reliable. They worked through the methods section by section, post-selection, post-setting, bracing, roofing, wall construction, floor design, threshold drainage, maintenance and repair. Each section included measurements, materials lists, and warnings about common mistakes. The experimental section was shorter but more exciting. It included the branching design, the removable panels, the wider passages for sled traffic. It included ideas they had not yet tested. A passage with a translucent roof made from scraped hides. A passage with a heating system that used the warmth from a connected stable. Some of these ideas might work, some might not. The guide said so clearly. This will outlive us both, Torsten said when they finished the last section. He was holding the stack of pages, 23 sheets covered front and back in Ragnar's careful handwriting. Long after we're dead, people will be building from these words. That is the point. It is. He set the pages down and looked at her. I did not expect to find a student at my age. I did not expect to find someone worth teaching. You found someone who needed to learn. I found someone who was already learning. That is different. Torsten coughed, a wet sound that Ragna had been hearing more often lately. I have not been well this winter. The cold gets into my chest and does not leave. You should rest more. I should do many things. He coughed again, harder this time. I should have built my own covered way years ago. I should have taught more people what I knew. I should have. The cough interrupted him, bending him over the table until his forehead nearly touched the pages they had written. Ragna waited until the fit passed. Then she said, You should stay here tonight. It is too cold to walk back to town. I have a room. You have a bed here, in the corner. Nels can sleep with me. Torsten looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, the way he nodded when she got something right. Just for tonight, he said. He stayed for 3 weeks. The cough did not improve. It got worse, deeper, wetter, more frequent. Ragna sent word to the doctor in town, but the doctor was busy with other patients, other emergencies, and by the time he came, there was little he could do. His lungs are filling, the doctor said, standing outside the cabin where Torsten could not hear. It happens with old men who have worked in the cold their whole lives. The body gives out eventually. How long does he have? Days, maybe a week, maybe less. Ragna went back inside and sat with Torsten. He was propped up on the bed she had made for him in the corner, wrapped in blankets, his breathing shallow and labored. I heard him, Torsten said. Doctors always think walls are thicker than they are. You should not be listening. I should not be dying either, but here we are. He coughed, a smaller sound than before, as if he no longer had the strength for the larger ones. I have a request. Name it. The guide. Make sure it gets to the right people. Not Vic, not anyone who will sell it or hoard it. People who will use it, people who will build from it. I will. And he paused, gathering breath. Keep building. Keep teaching. You have a gift for it. Do not let it go to waste. Ragna felt her eyes burn. She blinked hard, refusing to let the tears fall where he could see them. I will not waste it, she said. Good. Torsten closed his eyes. Good. He slept after that. He slept for most of the next 3 days, waking only to drink water, or cough, or speak a few words in Norwegian that Ragna only half understood. Words from his childhood, she thought, memories surfacing as the present slipped away. On the fourth day, he did not wake. They buried Torsten Vale on the first day of April in the small cemetery at the edge of town where the ground was finally soft enough to dig without picks. The minister spoke words. A few people came, the Iversons, the Dahls, Elias Broder, some others who had known Torsten from his years at the mill. Ragna stood at the edge of the grave with Nels beside her, the stack of pages they had written together tucked inside her coat. After the others left, she stayed. The grave was a dark rectangle in the muddy ground, the fresh earth piled beside it like a wound. She looked at it for a long time, thinking about all the things Torsten had taught her, and all the things she had learned by failing, and all the things she still did not know. The spring wind was cold on her face. Somewhere in the distance she could hear water running, snow melt, feeding the creeks that would feed the river that would carry the timber downstream when the cutting season started again. She thought about the passage, her passage, standing in her yard, connecting her cabin to her woodshed. She thought about the guide in her coat, 23 pages of methods and measurements and principles. She thought about the people who had already built covered ways from her teaching and the people who would build them from the guide after she was gone. Torsten had said the guide would outlive them both. He had been right, but he had not lived to see it distributed, to see it used, to see the thing they had built together become something larger than either of them. That was her job now. She touched the grave marker, a simple wooden cross with his name carved into it, and then she turned and walked away. The spring brought new challenges. The snow melted and the ice broke up, and the ground turned to mud so deep that wagons sank to their axles on the roads. But the mud was a problem for everyone, and Ragna had other concerns. Nels was healthy again, fully recovered from the fever that had frightened her so badly in January. He was growing fast now, shooting up like a weed, his trousers too short and his sleeves too short, and his appetite larger than the food she had to feed him. He needed new clothes. He needed shoes. He needed 100 things that cost money she did not have. The guide had to be copied before it could be distributed. She needed paper, ink, someone with a steadier hand than hers who could make the copies clean and readable. That cost money too. And the debt to Vic still sat in his ledger, untouched since September, accumulating interest at a rate she preferred not to think about. She needed income. She needed a way to convert the knowledge in her head into the currency that kept people fed and clothed and out of the storekeeper's grip. The answer came from an unexpected direction. The Lindqvist family had a problem. Their dairy operation was the largest in the settlement. 30 head of cattle, a barn that could hold twice that many, a milk house where they processed cream and butter for sale. The operation made money, good money, enough money to make them the wealthiest family within 20 miles. But their milk house was 120 feet from the main barn. In summer, that distance was nothing. In winter, it was a gauntlet. The ice storm in January had cost them 3 days of production when the workers could not safely cross the yard. 3 days of milk spoiled, cream unsold, butter unmade. The losses had been substantial. Eric Lindqvist came to Ragna's door on a morning in late April, hat in hand, a man who was not accustomed to asking anyone for anything. "I want to hire you," he said. "Hire me for what?" "To build a covered way. For my barn to my milk house. 120 feet. Ragna stared at him. 120 feet was more than twice the length of her own passage. It would require more posts, more bark, more labor than anything she had attempted. "That is a large project," she said. "I know. That is why I am willing to pay well for it." Lindqvist named a figure that made Ragna's breath catch. It was more money than she had seen in one place since arriving in Wisconsin. More than enough to pay off Vic, more than enough to buy clothes for Nels, paper and ink for the guide, supplies for the summer. "I would need help," she said. "I cannot build 120 feet alone. I have workers, strong backs who can dig and haul and lift. What I do not have is someone who knows how to build the thing correctly, someone who has built one that works." Lindqvist looked at her directly. "You are that someone. Everyone says so." Everyone? The word echoed in her mind. 4 months ago, everyone had laughed. "I will do it," she said. The Lindqvist project took 6 weeks. Ragnar worked alongside the hired men, directing the post setting, supervising the roofing, demonstrating the bark overlap and the moss packing and the floor construction. She taught as she worked, explaining the principles Torsten had taught her, answering questions, correcting mistakes before they became problems. The men were skeptical at first, taking orders from a woman, a widow, someone half their size and with none of their experience in heavy labor. But they watched her walk the passage she had built on her own property. They watched her check alignment by eye. They watched her solve problems they could not have solved on their own. By the 3rd week, they were calling her Mrs. Halverson with something that sounded almost like respect. The passage rose in stages, posts first, then bracing, then roof poles, then bark. 120 feet of covered route, stretching from the barn doors to the milk house entrance. The Lindqvist workers could not believe how much material it required, how much labor it demanded, how much precision it needed at every joint and seam. "This is not building," one of them said, watching Ragna adjust the pitch of a roof section. "This is, I do not know what this is." "This is routing," Ragna said, "building a way through." The secondary crisis came in the 5th week of the project. A wet spring storm blew in from the southwest, not ice this time, but rain so heavy it overwhelmed every drainage system in the settlement. Creeks overflowed. Roads washed out. The low areas turned into ponds overnight. The Thorson family, the ones whose father had cracked his skull on the ice, lived in one of those low areas. Their cabin was surrounded by water. Their woodshed, which they had not yet connected with a covered way, was unreachable. Their fire was going out, and they had 4 children under the age of 10. Word reached Ragna at the Lindqvist site. She left the workers with instructions and walked 3 miles through the rain to the Thorson place. What she found was worse than she expected. The cabin sat on a slight rise, but the water had crept up to within a few feet of the door. The woodshed was on lower ground, completely surrounded, a dark island in a shallow lake of muddy water. The father was inside, still suffering from his head injury, unable to help. The mother was standing at the door, watching the water rise, holding a baby who would not stop crying. "We have nothing left to burn," the mother said. Her voice was flat, exhausted. "We burned the last of the kindling this morning. The children are cold. The baby is cold." Ragna looked at the water. She looked at the woodshed. She looked at the distance between them, maybe 40 feet, but 40 feet of water that might be knee-deep or waist-deep or deeper. She thought about Torsten. She thought about what he would do. Then she waded in. The water was cold, shockingly cold, cold enough to make her gasp. It reached her thighs at the deepest point, pulling at her skirts, threatening to knock her off balance. But she kept moving, one step at a time, until she reached the woodshed door. The wood inside was damp, but not soaked. She loaded herself with as much as she could carry and waded back. She made the trip 4 times. By the 4th trip, she was shaking so badly she could barely walk. But the fire in the Thorson cabin was burning again, and the children were warming themselves beside it, and the baby had stopped crying. "Why did you do that?" the mother asked. You could have drowned. No, I could not, Ragna said. I could feel the bottom with every step. The water is shallow. It only looks deep. She did not mention the cold that was seeping into her bones, the exhaustion that was making her vision blur, the certainty that she would be sick for days after this. Those things did not matter. What mattered was that the Thorson children were warm. The Lindqvist project finished on schedule. 120 feet of covered passage connecting barn to milk house, built to specifications Ragna had developed from Torsten's teachings and her own experience. The workers stood at one end and looked down the length of it, a wooden throat stretching across the yard, roofed and walled and floored, ready for the winter that would come again. Eric Lindqvist paid her the full amount they had agreed on. He also gave her a bonus, 50 pounds of flour, a side of bacon, a bolt of cloth for making clothes. You have earned more than I paid you, he said. This will save me money for the next 20 winters. That is the idea, Ragna said. She walked home with her payment, thinking about what came next. The guide needed to be copied. The debt to Vic needed to be paid. Nels needed shoes. But first, she needed to rest. The cold from the Thorson rescue had settled into her chest, and she had been coughing for 3 days. She thought about Torsten. She thought about his chest filling up, his breath getting shorter, his life running out in a corner of her cabin. She was not ready to follow him yet. She had too much left to do. Silas Vick was waiting for her when she reached her property. He was standing in the yard near the entrance to the passage, looking at the structure with an expression she could not read. When he saw her coming down the track, he turned and waited, hands clasped behind his back. Mrs. Halverson, he said. Mr. Vick. I understand congratulations are in order. The Lindqvist project was quite an accomplishment. It was work. I was paid for it. You were paid well for it, from what I hear. Vic's eyes flickered to the sack she was carrying, the supplies visible through the cloth. Well enough to settle your account with my store, perhaps? Ragna felt a cold that had nothing to do with the illness in her chest. I intend to pay what I owe. I'm glad to hear it. The interest has been accumulating, as you know. What was $14 in September is now, he paused, as if calculating, $22.30 as of yesterday. $22. The number hit her like a blow. She had known the interest was adding up, but she had not realized how quickly. I have the money, she said. I will bring it to the store tomorrow. That would be acceptable. Vic smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I must say, you've surprised me. When I offered to buy your timber last fall, I thought you were making a mistake. A widow, alone, building something no one had ever seen. I gave you 6 weeks before you failed. I did not fail. No, you did not. The smile faded. You built something people wanted. You taught them to build it themselves. You turned a desperate gamble into what? A business? A calling? A way of thinking that is spreading through this settlement like a disease? I would not call it a disease. No? Then what would you call it when a storekeeper who has held notes on half the claims in this county suddenly finds his debtors building their way out of trouble instead of drowning in it? Vic's voice had changed, harder now, the calculation visible on the surface. The Dahls paid off their note last month. The Iversons paid off half of theirs. Even the Gunderson widower, who I thought would lose his place for certain, has suddenly found the resources to keep his head above water. Do you know what all those families have in common? They built covered ways. They learned from you. Vic stepped closer. You have cost me money, Mrs. Halverson. Quite a lot of money. I do not appreciate being cost money. Ragna stood her ground. I have not cost you anything. I have helped people survive. Survival is not free. Someone always pays. In the past, it was often me buying the claims they could not hold, selling the improvements they could not finish. Vic's eyes were flat, unblinking. You have changed the equation. You have taught them that they do not need to fail. That makes you my competitor. I am not competing with you. I am teaching people to build things. You are teaching people to stop needing me. That is competition, whether you intend it or not. He smiled again, colder than before. Pay your debt tomorrow, all of it. I will not extend further credit to you, regardless of what you build or who you build it for. He turned and walked away. Ragna watched him go, her hands trembling slightly, the illness in her chest making it hard to breathe. She had made an enemy, a real one, not just a skeptic who thought she was foolish. Silas Vic would not forgive her for costing him money. He would not forget, but she could not unlearn what she had learned. She could not unbuild what she had built, and she could not stop teaching, no matter what it cost her. She went inside, paid Nels to count out $22.30 from the Lindqvist payment, and set it aside for the morning. Then she sat down at the table, picked up the guide she and Torsten had written, and began making the first copy. The copies took longer than Ragna expected. Each page had to be written by hand, the letters formed carefully, the measurements checked and rechecked. A single error could mean a passage that collapsed, a floor that iced over, a family that trusted the guide and paid for that trust with their lives. She could not afford errors. She worked at night, after Nels was asleep, by the light of a single lamp that cost oil she could barely afford. Her hand cramped, her eyes burned. But page by page, the copies accumulated, first one complete guide, then two, then three. By midsummer, she had made 7 copies. She gave the first to Marta Iverson. The second went to the dolls. The third went to a minister who traveled between settlements and promised to share it with families who needed the knowledge. The fourth, fifth, and sixth went to people who came to her door asking for help, people who lived too far away to visit regularly, people who needed to build on their own. The 7th she kept for herself, tucked into the same chest where she kept her marriage certificate and the lock of hair she had cut from Jens's head before they buried him. You should sell them, Elias Broder said when he heard what she was doing. He had come by to check on the passage, a habit he had developed since the ice storm, as if he needed to see it standing to believe it was real. People would pay for that knowledge. You could make a living from it. I am making a living. The Lindqvist project paid well. Others will pay for building, not for reading. And the guide? The guide is not for sale. Ragna set down the pen she had been using and flexed her cramped fingers. Torsten and I did not write it to make money. We wrote it so people would stop dying from 50 feet of open ground. Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You are a strange woman, Mrs. Halverson. I have been called worse. You have been called worse by me. His voice was gruff, but there was something underneath it that might have been respect. I was wrong about you. I do not say that often, but I am saying it now. You built something that matters. You're giving it away instead of hoarding it. That is, he paused, searching for the word. That is not what I expected from a widow with nothing. I do not have nothing. I have knowledge. Knowledge is not nothing. The summer brought growth, not just in the gardens and fields where the crops were coming in strong after a wet spring, but in the settlement itself. New families arrived, some drawn by the cheap land, some by the timber, some by word that had spread about a community where people helped each other survive. Several of the new families came to Ragna before they had been in the settlement a week. "We heard about the covered ways," one man said. He was young, maybe 25, with a wife who looked barely 20 and a baby who could not have been more than 6 months old. "We heard that people here build them to connect their houses to their sheds. We heard that a woman teaches how to do it." "I can teach you," Ragna said. "But teaching takes time, and you have a cabin to build before winter." "We have a cabin. The previous owners left it. What we do not have is a way to reach our woodpile when the ice comes." Ragna looked at the young man, at his wife holding the baby, at the hope and fear mixed together in their faces. They had come to Wisconsin with dreams, the same way she had come with dreams. They did not want to die of those dreams. "Come to my place tomorrow morning," she said. "I will show you how to start." The teaching continued through the fall. Ragna developed a routine. Mornings were for her own work, maintaining the passage, cutting wood for winter, tending the small garden she had planted behind the cabin. Afternoons were for teaching, for the families who came with questions, for the trips to neighboring properties where she helped set posts and hang bark and pack moss into seams. She charged for the building work now. Not much, less than Lindqvist had paid, less than her labor was worth, but enough to keep food on the table and clothes on Nels's back. The families who could not pay in money paid in other ways: a sack of flour, a side of bacon, help with chores she could not manage alone. The settlement was changing around her. By the time the first hard frost came in late October, there were 11 covered passages in the area, her original one, Marta's, the Lindqvist project, and 8 others built by families who had learned from the guide or from her direct teaching. Some were short, barely 20 feet. Some were longer than hers. One family had built a branching design that connected their cabin to both their woodshed and their chicken coop, creating a small network of protected routes. The visual landscape was different now. Where before there had been isolated cabins surrounded by open ground, now there were connections, narrow lines of covered passage threading between buildings, linking people to the resources they needed, reducing the deadly distance that winter created. Not everyone had built one. Some families could not afford the materials. Some did not believe they needed to. Some were too proud to learn from a woman, too stubborn to accept that the way they had always done things might not be the only way. But enough had built them that the idea was no longer strange. It was no longer the Halverson folly. It was simply a part of how people lived here, as ordinary as a fence or a well. Anders Lunde arrived in November. He came to Ragna's door on a cold morning, hat in hand, a man in his middle 30s with shoulders like a draft horse and hands that were scarred and calloused from years of working metal. He was a blacksmith by trade, a farmer by necessity, and a widower by the same cruel chance that had made Ragna a widow. "I am looking for Mrs. Halverson," he said, "the one who builds the covered ways." "You have found her." "Good." He reached into the sack he was carrying and produced a set of iron strap hinges, beautifully made, the kind of hardware that Ragna could not afford and had never been able to find in Vic's store. "I have a proposal. I will trade you these for knowledge." Ragna looked at the hinges. They were exactly what she needed for the passage doors, better than the salvaged hardware she had been using, stronger, more durable. She looked at the man holding them. "What knowledge do you want?" "I want to learn how to build what you build. I have a farm 3 miles north, a cabin, a barn, a smithy. The barn is 100 feet from the cabin. The smithy is 50 feet the other direction. Every winter I lose time walking between them. Every storm I risk my neck crossing open ground." "You want to connect all 3 buildings?" "I want to learn how. Then I want to build it myself." Anders set the hinges on the ground between them. "I am not asking for charity. I am offering trade. These hinges are worth $4. Your time is worth more. but I can make more hinges. I can make hardware for your passages, latches, brackets, corner irons, things that will last longer than wood pegs and salvaged nails. Ragnar studied his face. He was not handsome exactly. His features were too rough for that, weathered by forge heat and winter cold. But there was something steady in his eyes, something that reminded her of the way Torsten had looked when he was assessing a piece of work. "Why did you come to me?" she asked. "The guide is available. You could learn from reading it." "I tried. The guide is good for someone who already understands construction. I am a smith, not a builder. I can read the words and not see the thing they describe." He shrugged, a movement that involved more muscle than most people could manage. "I learn by watching, by doing, by having someone show me where I am wrong." The words echoed in Ragnar's memory. "Teaching means showing you where your work is wrong so you can fix it yourself." "Come back tomorrow," she said. "We will start in the morning." The partnership began as teaching and became something else. Anders was a quick learner, quicker than Ragnar had expected from someone who claimed not to understand construction. He had a smith's eye for stress and load, a smith's instinct for where metal and wood would fail under pressure. When she explained the principles of bracing and pitch and moisture control, he translated them into terms he already understood. "This is like a forge frame," he said one afternoon, studying the diagonal braces on a post. "The heat wants to twist the iron. The braces keep it straight. Here, the wind wants to twist the posts. The braces do the same thing." "That is exactly right." "Then why did it take me so long to see it? I have been looking at your passage for a week. I did not see the connection until you explained it." "Because no one showed you how to look." Ragnar ran her hand along the brace. "I did not see it either at first. Torsten had to show me. Then I had to practice until seeing became natural." Anders was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Will you teach me to see the way you see?" "I am trying to." "I know. That is why I asked." He looked at her directly, the same steady gaze she had noticed when they first met. "You are a good teacher, better than you know." The words warmed something in her chest that she had not realized was cold. The work on Anders's property began in early December. It was ambitious, a three-way junction that would connect his cabin, barn, and smithy through a central hub. The design was based on the branching pattern she and Torsten had developed, but scaled up and adapted for the longer distances involved. Anders worked beside her every day. His strength made tasks that would have taken her hours into tasks that took minutes. Posts that she would have struggled to lift, he set in place with ease. Bark sheets that she would have wrestled onto the roof, he handed up to her as casually as passing a plate at dinner. But it was not just his strength that made him valuable. It was his mind. He improved the hardware as they worked. The latches he made were better than anything available at the store, smoother, stronger, with a clever mechanism that kept them from freezing shut in cold weather. The corner irons he forged tied the bracing together more securely than wood pegs alone. The threshold brackets he designed lifted the floor slightly at the entrances, improving drainage without creating a step that could trip someone in the dark. "You are not just building what I teach you," Ragnar said one evening, examining a hinge he had made for the junction hub. "You are making it better." "I am making it mine." Anders set down his tools. "You taught me the principles. The application is my own contribution." "That is," she paused, searching for the right word. "That is what Torsten hoped the guide would do. He wanted people to understand the principles well enough to improve on them." "Then Torsten was wise, and you are wise for listening to him." The conversation continued, drifting from construction to other things, their childhoods, their families, the paths that had brought them to this place. Ragna learned that Anders had come from Denmark, that his wife had died in childbirth along with the baby, that he had spent 3 years alone on his farm before deciding he needed to change something about how he was living. "I came here to learn from you," he said, "but I am learning more than how to build passages. I am learning that being alone is not the same as being strong." "No," Ragna said, "it is not." The second winter tested everything they had built. The ice storm came in late January, not as severe as the one 2 years before, but bad enough. Freezing rain for 2 days. Temperatures that dropped and held. The yard between cabin and barn turned to glass, exactly as it had before. But this time, Ragna was not alone. Anders made the trip through his newly completed passage, walking from the smithy to the cabin to the barn without ever stepping on open ice. His livestock stayed fed. His forge stayed hot. His life continued with barely an interruption. Across the settlement, the story was the same. The families who had built covered ways survived. The families who had not struggled through, some making it, some not, some falling on ice that their neighbors had learned to avoid. Vic lost 2 more debtors that winter, not to death, to success. 2 families who had been on the edge of defaulting paid off their notes instead, using money they had saved because they had not lost livestock to cold, had not lost work time to injury, had not lost anything to the killing distance of open ground. Ragna heard about it from Marta, who heard about it from someone who worked at the store. "He is furious," Marta said. "He spent all of last summer expecting to foreclose on the Bergman place, and now they have paid in full. He blames you." "He can blame me all he wants. I did not make him give them credit." "No, you just taught them how to stop needing it." Marta smiled, a rare expression on her practical face. "That is worse," in his mind. "You did not beat him. You made him irrelevant." The confrontation with Vic came on the first day of March. Ragna was in town, buying supplies at the store, when Vic came out from behind the counter and blocked her path to the door. "Mrs. Halverson," he said. "A word." "I am in a hurry, Mr. Vic." "Then I will be brief." His voice was flat, controlled, but something burned underneath it. "You have cost me a great deal of money over the past 2 years. You have taught half the settlement to build their way out of trouble instead of coming to me for help. You have made my loans less valuable, my foreclosures less certain, my entire business less profitable. That was not my intention. Your intention does not matter. The result matters." Vic stepped closer. "I am a patient man, Mrs. Halverson. I have watched you build your little empire of hallways and hinges and helpful advice. I have watched people who used to need me learn to need you instead. And I have waited." "Waited for what?" "For you to fail." His smile was thin, cold. Everyone fails eventually. Everyone makes a mistake, takes a risk that does not pay off, trusts the wrong person. When that happens to you, and it will, I will be here, and my offer will be lower than it was the first time." Ragna looked at him, at the calculation in his eyes, the resentment barely hidden beneath the surface, the certainty that the world worked the way he believed it worked. "You are right about one thing," she said. "I will fail eventually. Everyone does. But failure is not the end. Failure is information. You learn from it, and you build again." She stepped around him, heading for the door. "I learned that from a man who died teaching me. I do not expect you to understand it." She left him standing in the store, the supplies she had bought under her arm, her heart pounding hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. Vic's moment came the following winter. A storm hit the settlement in February, not ice this time, but wind. Wind that howled across the open ground, that tore shingles from roofs, that knocked down fences and scattered livestock and tested every structure in the county. Vic's own property was on the east edge of town, where the wind hit hardest. His shed, where he kept the goods he could not fit in the store, was 50 feet from his back door, across open ground he had never bothered to connect. The wind knocked him down twice before he could reach it. The third time, he did not get up. They found him the next morning, lying face down in the snow, his right leg twisted at an angle that meant it was broken. He was alive, barely. The cold had crept into him during the night, and the doctor said it was a miracle his heart had not stopped. He lived, but the leg never healed right. He walked with a cane after that, and the limp was visible from 100 feet away. Someone had to help him cross the yard to his shed after the storm. He could not make it alone. The irony was not lost on anyone. Ragna went to him a week after the storm. She did not go to gloat. She did not go to lecture. She went because she remembered what Torsten had said about men like Vic, that they never forgave people who cost them money, that they waited for opportunities to strike back, that they nursed their grievances like wounds that would not heal. She did not want to be that kind of person. Vic was sitting in his store when she arrived, his broken leg propped on a stool, his face gray with pain and something that might have been humiliation. "I came to offer help," she said. "I do not need your help. You need a covered way from your house to your shed. You cannot cross that distance safely anymore." Vic's jaw tightened. "And you want to build it for me. Prove your superiority. Rub my face in what I said about you." "I want to build it for you because you need it. Because 50 feet of open ground almost killed you. Because no one should die from a distance they could survive if they had the right structure." She paused. "I am not charging you anything. Consider it repayment for all the credit you extended to families who could not have survived without it." The words were calculated, not entirely true, but true enough. Vic had extended credit. He had charged interest, had waited for defaults, had profited from desperation. But he had also kept people fed and clothed during seasons when they had nothing else. The credit had been exploitative. It had also been necessary. Vic stared at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, something shifted in his expression. Not gratitude. He was not capable of gratitude. But something that might have been recognition. "You are not what I thought you were," he said. "No, I am not." "Fine." He looked away. "Build your hallway, but I am not going to thank you for it." "I did not ask you to." The passage at Vic's property took 2 weeks to build. Anders helped with the heavy work, and 3 of the families Ragna had taught contributed labor in exchange for nothing but the satisfaction of seeing the thing done. When it was finished, Vic walked the length of it, slowly, leaning on his cane, but walking, upright, unassisted, alive. He did not thank her, but he stopped speaking against her in public. And when people came to his store asking about covered ways, he pointed them toward Ragna's property instead of dismissing the idea. It was not forgiveness. It was not friendship. But it was surrender, and that was enough. The years that followed moved faster than Ragna expected. Anders proposed in the spring of the year they finished Vic's passage. He did it while they were setting posts on a project 3 miles from town, his hands covered in mud, his face flushed with effort, his words as plain and practical as the man himself. "I want to build with you," he said. "Not just passages, everything. A life, a family, whatever comes." Ragna looked at him, at the man who had come to her door with hinges and a request to learn, who had become her partner in work, and then something more. "Yes," she said. They married that summer in the small church at the edge of town, with Nels standing beside them and half the settlement in attendance. The minister who performed the ceremony was the same one who had carried copies of the guide to settlements across the region. He said afterward that he had married dozens of couples, but never two who seemed to understand each other so completely. The years after that were full. Children came, 3 of them, 2 girls and a boy, born in the cabin Ragna had defended against the ice. The cabin expanded as the family grew, new rooms added, new passages connecting the new structures, until the property looked less like a homestead and more like a small village of protected roots. Anders's smithy produced hardware that spread across the region, hinges and latches and brackets designed specifically for covered ways, stamped with a small mark that meant they had come from the Halvorsen forge. The hardware became as recognizable as the passages themselves. Ragna kept teaching. She taught her children first, then the children of families who had learned from her years before. She taught young couples arriving in the settlement, old farmers who had finally admitted they needed help, skeptics who had laughed at the idea until they fell on ice and understood. The guide multiplied. Copies of copies spread to settlements 50 miles away, 100 miles away, places Ragna had never seen and would never visit. She heard stories sometimes, families she had never met, building passages from instructions she had written, surviving winters that would have killed them without the knowledge. Nels grew into a man. He learned his mother's trade and his stepfather's, becoming both a builder and a smith, someone who could construct a passage from post to roof and forge the hardware to hold it together. He married at 22, built a home of his own, connected it to his mother's property with a passage that stretched a quarter-mile through the woods. The settlement grew around them. Where there had been 50 families when Ragna arrived, there were 200 by the time her hair turned gray. The covered ways were everywhere now, not just connecting houses to sheds, but linking neighbors to neighbors, creating networks of protected routes that turned isolated homesteads into communities. Not everyone built them. Some people still relied on open ground, on the old ways, on the belief that winter could be survived through endurance alone. Some of them succeeded, some did not, but the idea had taken root. It had spread. It had become part of how people thought about distance and cold and the gap between where they were and where they needed to be. That was enough. Ragna lived to see the century turn. She was 73 years old in 1900, her hair white, her hands still strong enough to pack moss into a seam, her eyes still sharp enough to spot a post that was not plumb. Anders had died 2 years before, peacefully in his sleep, after a day spent teaching his grandson how to temper iron. She missed him, but she did not stop working. The last passage she built was a short one, 30 feet, connecting her cabin to the small structure where she kept her tools. She built it alone over the course of 3 weeks because she wanted to prove to herself that she still could. When it was finished, she walked its length in the dark, feeling the floor beneath her boots, the walls brushing her shoulders, the roof solid above her head. 50 years. 50 years since she had arrived in this place with nothing but a trunk and a husband and a son who barely reached her hip. 50 years since Jens had died and left her alone with the math of survival. 50 years since she had stood in her yard and looked at the distance between her cabin and her woodshed and decided to build a way through it. The passage she had built that first winter was still standing. The posts had been replaced twice, the bark 3 times, the floor 4 times, but the route was the same. 50 feet of covered way from her door to her fuel, exactly as she had designed it. She had walked it 10,000 times, maybe more. She had stopped counting decades ago. On a morning in late January of 1901, Ragna woke to the sound of freezing rain on the roof. She lay in bed for a moment, listening to the familiar tap and hiss, feeling the cold pressing against the walls. Then she rose, dressed in the dark, and walked to the window. The yard was glazing over. The fence rails were beginning to bow. The trees were starting to droop under the weight of accumulated ice. She thought about the morning 50 years before, the morning after the first great ice storm, when she had opened her door and seen a world made of glass. She thought about Nels, burning with fever in the corner. She thought about the neighbors who had come to her door, desperate, freezing, unable to reach their own fuel. She thought about Elias Broder standing in her yard, delivering his verdict. You keep stealing logs from your stove and your boy will freeze before Candlemas. Ragna smiled. She walked to the inner door of the passage, the same door she had cut through the wall 5 decades ago, rebuilt twice since then, still opening onto the same protected route. She unbarred it and stepped through. The passage was dark, cold. The ice was drumming on the roof, exactly as it had drummed 50 years before. But the roof was holding. The walls were solid. The floor was rough beneath her boots, giving traction, keeping her upright. She walked. 50 feet. The same 50 feet she had measured with a stick in the autumn of 1886. The same 50 feet that Elias had said would kill her. The same 50 feet that had become the distance between death and life, between failure and success, between the woman she had been and the woman she had become. At the woodshed door she paused. Outside she could hear the ice cracking in the trees. She could hear the wind testing the roof. She could hear winter doing what winter had always done, trying to find the weakness, the gap, the distance that would let it through. Inside she could hear her own breathing, slow, steady, alive. She opened the shed door. The wood was there, dry and waiting, exactly as it had always been. She loaded her apron with split birch, closed the door, and walked back through the passage to her cabin. The fire was low. She fed it. Outside, the settlement was waking to an ice storm that would have killed half of them 50 years ago. Now, through the windows, she could see the dark lines of covered passages stretching between buildings, her legacy multiplied across 100 properties, protecting 1,000 people who would never know her name. She had been 29 years old when she built the first one. She had been alone, desperate, laughed at by everyone who should have known better. They had counted the wood. She had counted the steps. Ragna Tveit Holvorsen sat down beside her fire, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, and watched the ice storm through the window. The passage stood between her and the cold. It had always stood. It would stand after she was gone. That was the thing about routes. Once you built them, they stayed.